I'm Ed Raby, otherwise known as the Rabid Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video, so please feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. Welcome to my channel. Religion has actually convinced people that there is an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do, every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you. George Carlin. I am wrapping up my 4 main theological objections to Christianity in this series. If you want to go back and look at the first video in this series and follow your way through it, I'll leave a card up at the top so you can do that. But I'm wrapping this up with the simple but profound fact that the God of the Bible is very suspect as far as whether or not he is just and acts with justice. I would go so far to say that the God of the Bible does not follow his own clearly stated guidelines for justice. 1, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and 2, restitution included. Namely, that the punishment should fit the crime and the restitution, when merited, should be offered. This is the standard of justice found in the Torah or Law of Moses. Jesus of Nazareth takes this on in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5-7. Pointing out that the principles of justice were still valid, and in fact, because things should be done for the love of God, they were even more challenging. For instance, it's no longer about adultery, it's about lusting. It's no longer about killing, it's about anger. God expects Christians to still be just and follow his principles of justice. The issue is, does the God of the Bible follow his own rules? I would say not. From a standpoint of my own faith, the biblical God's justice, and in particular the doctrine of hell, has always been a problem. My standard answer throughout my days as a pastor to others that asked me was that the justice of God was a mystery, that someday we would know it all and see that this God was just to send people to hell, even if they were people who we loved and who this God claimed to love. But it was more than that, as some of the stories of God executing justice were a little lacking justice themselves. Job is a good example where God allows the devil to kill all of Job's children and servants, save for a few, and does it simply to test to see if Job will remain faithful. The biblical God's answer when Job questions him about this is, "I'm God, that's why," is a little lacking in reasoning or power for a supreme being. For the whole situation is lacking in passion, not just for Job, but for all the people slain for another. They all lived and died simply to satisfy a bet between the devil and the Almighty is a little much to reconcile with the idea of God's is love. Stuff like this definitely tests your faith, and it should. The thing that most religious responses to the justice of God dilemma is either to cite mystery, read, "I don't have a reasonable answer, so I'm going to punt," or our ignorance. Simply put, they both attempt to put God on a different standard of justice than we follow. How convenient. But it's also telling that we cannot even use the standard of eye for an eye with the biblical God. The very standard that God follows, that he gives to us, he does not follow. The fact that I used to come up with this double standard for God myself bothered me for years when I realized that that is exactly what I was doing. A standard of justice is only viable if it can be applied to all. It should be logical and consistent enough that it can be applied to all without exception. We have learned not to tolerate double standards between those who lead and those that follow, so why here? Why does the God of the Bible get a free pass for being hypocritical? Why the special pleading? Religion does its damnness to keep us from seeing this, and it does it by trying to make God so high his different standard of justice is not justified. It sounds like a ruling religious class seeking to justify that they impose rules on others that they do not have to follow. After all, they are men of God, and so as Cardinal Richelieu points out in Three Musketeers, The cardinal is not subject to the laws of men. Easy to justify if you create a different standard of justice for your God, and you then say you're subject to that standard, not the standard of men. But the biblical God fails theologically, and it comes out best in the doctrine of hell and final judgment. Everything we will do in this short temporal time of existence, but everything about the final judgment of God, of the Bible, is eternal. In short, this God is going to punish us in a way that is eternal and permanent for our behavior in a temporal and non-permanent existence. This includes the annihilation and eternal punishment point of views. The only thing that might save Christianity here as far as theology is the actual idea of purgatory that the Catholics have, where the punishment is redemptive and not permanent. But even here, there is a possibility that the punishment can last centuries compared to the shortness of life. So being burned like the rich man is said to be burned in Luke chapter 16 is somehow eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. In that story, the rich man is burned not because he defied God, but because he had a good life, and Lazarus is rewarded because he had suffered in life. Go look at the story in Luke 16 for yourself. This is the rationale that is actually given by Christ. So because the guy had it good, he is punished with burning fire? How is this eye for an eye? Justice would have been for the two to trade places for a second life, not that he was burned for a long time. There is little justice in the story. Just a God who, on the one hand, in the Old Testament tells people who have prosperity as a sign of God's blessing, and then turns around and saying that if you become prosperous in the New Testament, that the biblical God is going to burn you as punishment for it. In a full analysis of the biblical account, not only are there many accounts where God's justice is a little suspect, but where he violates the very rules he sets forward because he gets jealous or angry. Like other mythologies, the biblical God is very human and reflects probably more of an attitude of the author of that particular passage than the Almighty that actually might exist, if he exists at all, which I doubt. More troubling for me recently is the fact that no theology of damnation other than the purgatory of the Catholics, and even then it only works for Catholics, allows people to gain heaven to appeal for those who they love who are in hell for God to be merciful. I have to ask what kind of compassion anyone has that will allow their loved one to burn for all eternity. I mean, if someone I love, like my children or grandparents, were an eternal lake of fire, and I knew this, I would have enough compassion on them to be in front of God every single moment of eternity begging for his mercy for them. How can you even say you have compassionate heart if you believe that your fellow human beings are going to be burned forever and you just shrug your shoulders and go, that's the way it is? But that brings up a question of God's mercy. Could you burn one of your children, parents, friends, etc., with forever fire simply because they violated your rules and didn't believe something you told them? For me, that is definitely a no. My love for them far outsees my desire for them to be under my control and do things as I wish, and that they would absolutely believe me. If that is true for me, why is God then an unmerciful bastard about this? How is it that he is the God that is love, has less compassion for some of his children than me for mine? Perhaps because he concoction of men who are in power and decide to control through fear. And yeah, I bet that's it, because the doctrine of hell definitely makes you afraid. For me personally, I come back to the quote from Marcus Aurelius I used before in the last video. If the gods that exist, if they were to exist, are just, they will judge us based on the virtues that we live by. If they are not just, then they do not deserve to be served. We as good people should not serve evil, even if that evil has great power. If there are no gods, which I think is the most likely scenario, we should live in such a way that we will be fondly remembered. I worry less about an afterlife, because regardless, it is in this life that I must live either way. I choose to live based on virtue because, in the end, it is all I really have. My own personal responsibility for the life I live is mine alone. Cue Robert Heinlein. I am free because I know that I alone am morally responsible for everything I do. I am free no matter what rules surround me. If I find them tolerable, I tolerate them. If I find them too obnoxious, I break them. I am free because I know that I alone am morally responsible for everything I do. Robert A. Heinlein. This has been an interesting experiment going through my 4 objections to Christianity once again. I've done this on my blog several times, but coming here on YouTube and doing it, I've began to look at things a little bit different. But now, if anything, as I've looked at these objections, once again, they've gotten stronger and more detailed and still form a bedrock of why I think Christianity is a man-made bad idea. But I'm now convinced it is also largely a fraud. Would also contend that it has been used, as I've tried to demonstrate several times in this series, much like Islam and Judaism and most of the other religions, to deceive, control, and manipulate others. The most troubling thing for me is I know many Christian friends and former friends have read these, and you know what? Crickets. Silence. My eternal fate is not so important that they will not even try to answer my objections. Perhaps the real truth is that these objections have no answer, and basically constitute the God of the Yahweh. They consign him, the God Yahweh, to the rest of mythology as another concoction of men, and his flaws simply a reflection of their thoughts about him being flawed. Because they had flawed standards of justice and ulterior motives, the God they created's execution of justice reflects this, as he also has flawed standards of justice and seems to have ulterior motives. It also speaks to the real beliefs of Christians. I know for a fact that many do not actually believe. I was a minister for 20 years, and I lost track of the number of people in my church who, when questioned, basically had done one of the following. They had picked and chosen which parts of Christian doctrine or Bible they liked and discarded the rest. They didn't really actually believe anything. They just went along with it for the community and to keep family happy. When questioned further, it always came back to one of what I call my 4 objections, in some form as to why they didn't believe or what they had chosen to discard. And all for them had basically become a tradition, not real faith or spirituality. This to me now is the most damaging thing and the most damning. We have spirituality in your life, but it's not genuine. Why do you have a part of your life basically that is a fraud? Would you not be better to be truly honest with yourself about where you are, spiritually speaking? It is my 4 objections that started me on the path to honest spiritual reflection and truly being who I am. I eventually landed in the place that I am now today, which is an atheist. I have very little belief in the possibility of there being a God. I'm now better for it, too, and a better person for it in many respects. Mostly I've stopped being a liar. This is the first real step on the path to finding truth. I want to thank all of you for staying around and listening to all 4 of these objections. If you haven't done so, you can go back to the beginning. I'll leave another card here that you can do that. But this series has been about why I left the faith, the 4 core reasons why I found the doctrines of Christianity to be untenable and, quite frankly, illogical and inconsistent. Strange for a message that's supposed to be so important. If the God that's supposedly proclaimed in the Bible says that this biblical message is so important that every human being needs to A, hear it, and B, understand it, he's done a very poor job of it. In the end, we can't trust the Bible to be infallible, inerrant, or even inspired. We can't even know that sin exists. Obviously, I think it's made up. And if sin is made up, then the solution to answer for sin is also made up, and quite frankly, unnecessary. And ultimately, at the end, any honest assessment of God of the Bible will find him to be an evil entity of unpleasant character, the most unpleasant character of all fiction, as Richard Dawkins said it. And I would agree with that. My hope in this series is that it will get you to at least think, that you'll begin to think about what you believe and why you believe it, and that you'll understand why skeptics such as myself, who have come out of that religion, still remain skeptical. I want to thank you for sticking around. Once again, welcome to my channel. You can leave your comments below, and they have a way of influencing the content of Friday's videos, and I will respond to them when I can. Videos are uploaded every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. One thing I won't tolerate in the common sense section, and you can be advised of this, is name calling. Be sure to like, subscribe, and get your notifications. I hope I've done my small part with this series in helping you maybe be convinced to be a rabid atheist yourself. In the meantime, have a good day. Goodbye.